Okay, so welcome to today's class, and we are talking about MySQL database. So as you all know that we are trying to introduce ourselves into database, or trying to understand what is database in the first place. So with me here, I have a slide which is based on MySQL database, and I saw it important that we actually go through this particular document just to get a good understanding, or just to get a clue of what MySQL database is concerned. Now, that is before the practical part. I know probably towards the end of this slide, that is the only time we're going to start the practical part, just to show you all the applications, all the features, or the application features that are required for us to use MySQL database. Now, as you all know that we have different types of databases out there, but for this particular part, we are inclining ourselves into understanding MySQL database. Now, for this particular concept, I'll just try to share this particular document. And if you look closely at this particular slide, the question is, what is database, or what is a database? What is a database? So we have like different definitions of database or databases, but at the end of it all, we will actually arrive at the same answer. It's all about what? Storing of files and easily accessing or easily retrieval of data. So you see, the reason why we have database in the first place is to store data. So without the data, then probably there are no reason for us now to have the database in place. So what is database? So a database is a structured set of data held in a computer, especially one that is accessible in various ways. So we are talking about a structured set of data. So the database must be structured in the first place to cater for data storage. So remember, all these data are not going to be stored randomly. And that would be based on, probably we'll look into the types of databases and we'll see how each one varies as far as the storing of data is concerned. But for this particular part, we are defining a database as a structured set of data held in a computer, especially that is accessible in various ways. Now, a database, again, is an organized collection of structured information or data, typically stored electronically in a computer system. So for this particular part, we're talking about organized collection of structured information. If you remember, probably during your first module or your first unit, that is Introduction to ICT or Fundamentals of Computing, we were actually in a position to see the differences between information and data. Now, remember, data is actually a raw material or unprocessed raw material for what? For information. So when you have, let's say, data, and this data does not make sense, then it qualifies as what? As a data. So we are talking about a data being a raw material for what? For information. It's actually data that makes up information. Now, when you group together this information, this particular data, it will now make sense, or it will now be converted into what? Into information. So information, on the other hand, is like a collection of data that is meaningful, or in other words, you can talk about organized data that is meaningful. So it's actually data that makes up what? Information. Now, so a database is an organized collection of structured information or data, typically stored electronically in a computer system. The data can then be easily accessed, managed, modified, updated, controlled, and organized. So we will talk about different ways of how we can access database data, or how we can access our data in the database, because as long as the database acts as a storage point, we should also have a way of retrieving or viewing or managing or modifying or trying to update or even organize the data in there. So we will learn about a specific language, and this particular language is called SQL. So most databases use a structured query language, that is SQL, for writing and querying data. So you can talk about SQL or SQL. So SQL or SQL stands for Structured Query Language. So that is a bigger part of this. For us to understand MySQL, or for us to understand any relational database, we must make sure that we get to know SQL in a more deeper way. Now, so on the next slide, we also have like another term which is more related to this. What is a database schema? What is a database schema? So a database schema is the skeleton structure that represents the logical view of the entire database. So you see, for example, we have the backbone, we have like the skeleton part. So when you talk about the framework, you can talk about the framework, or you can talk about the skeleton structure that represents the logical view of the entire database. So if you have that particular structure of how your database, or how you want your database to be structured or organized, then that forms as what? Or it becomes something called the database schema. It defines how the data is organized. If you're to store your data now in tables, then database schema will define that. So it defines how the data is organized and how the relations among them are associated. So for this particular part, we're talking about the relationships or relations. And in other words, relations means a table. We have like these terms. We have one, relations is equals to a table. So when you talk about relations in Oracle, in database, whether it's MySQL database or Oracle database, we are relating that to a table. When you talk about fields, fields means what? Fields means it is, it's equal to a column. And when you talk about a row, is equals to a record. So it defines how the data is organized and how the relations among them are associated. It formulates all the constraints that are to be applied on the data. So we will actually immerse ourselves on an understanding, or trying to understand how do we bring the relationships between relations, or between the tables. How do we organize data in MySQL, or how do we come up with the database schema? And again, how do we use constraints? Now, a database schema, that is another definition, defines its entities and the relationship among them. It defines its entities and the relationship among them. So we also have the word entities. And I know when we get to a unit called data modeling, which is still ahead of us, we will get to understand what is entity. So you see, before a table becomes a table in the physical model, we must start from the conceptual model or the logical model. So when you are at the conceptual or the logical model, you are trying to say that I will have a table here. So because in the logical model, we don't actually call a table, we call it an entity. So in the logical part, we are calling it an entity. But when it comes to the physical part, that means the actual implementation of the database, then we call it a table. So a database schema defines its entities and the relationship among them. It contains a descriptive detail of the database, which can be depicted by means of schema diagrams. It's the database designers who design the schema to help programmers understand the database and make it useful. So you see, we must have database designers. You are already going to, you're already a database designer because we are getting into this particular field or this particular career. So in this part, if we go to the next slide, we are talking about the types of databases. And for this particular part, I don't want us to immerse ourselves so much on some of these types of databases, because these are things that it will come, and we will actually come into terms with them. So just to know, or just to kill some curiosity about the types of databases, we have, for example, hierarchical database. we have network databases, we have object-oriented databases, we have relational databases, and we have NoSQL databases. So what is the difference among all these databases? Why don't we have like only one particular database? Yeah, so the reason why we have all these, or the differences between all these databases, is actually the way their database schema is structured, because we have different views. And again, the way the data are stored. You see, for example, we are talking about MySQL database, which in other words is a relational database. So if you look at the types of databases, you can tell which part does MySQL database falls into. So it actually falls under relational databases, because why? We have the word relational, and when you bring it again, in other words, we have relation, which is equal to a table. So that qualifies MySQL database to have tables for storage or for data storage. So in this case, I'm just going to show you like sample images about the types of databases. For example, we are talking about hierarchical. So hierarchical database model, this is how it stores what? It stores their data, or this is how the database schema is laid out. So it's more like an organizational chart or an organizational hierarchy, where you start from, let's say we have the CEO, then come down to director, then come down to managers, then come down to employees. So we have, for example, here like the root at the top, then we have the level 1, level 2, level 1, which all of them are actually what? The child. Then under each child, we also have like level 2. So it's actually broken down hierarchically. So we have different applications that uses or that stores their data in the hierarchical database model. Now, come back to the types of database. We also have something called the network. So when it comes to the network, you can see how it is. It is actually networked. That means we can have one table relating to more than one table. So you see how the arrows are moving. So project 1 is related to department A, department B. Department B is also related to project 2, project 2. So this is actually the type of network, type of database. So for example, it's more like when it comes to the types of networks, we have also the same thing. Now, going further, we have types of database, object-oriented database. Now, object-oriented database, this is how their data are actually stored, because they are inclined towards objects. So you see, for example, we have student as an object, daughter as an object, engineer as an object. All of them are pointing to one object, which is actually person. So we are actually orienting all the objects to one object. So here, the key important thing is about what? Where the arrows are pointing to. And then we come now to what we are expected to do as far as MySQL is concerned, which is called what? It is called the types of database, that is relational database. So the good thing about relational database is that it's a very simple database, and any particular type of database, apart from MySQL, if it falls under relational database, then it's actually very simple, easily to handle. Why? Because their tables or their data are actually stored in a table. So imagining it's more like an Excel sheet. So if you look at this, for example, we have columns and rows. So we have columns such as roll number, name, and phone. So all these are columns. And then we have the rows, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see that we can talk about the table name, which is student. We have the column name. We have the tuple or row. We also have the table relation. So when you talk about a table, you can also use the word relation, which will mean the same thing. And then coming down to NoSQL database. So NoSQL databases uses something called the key value, or it actually uses keys and values to store what? To store their data. Now, in this particular NoSQL database, it means that we do not actually have the schema. So the schema is not there. So that is the opposite of what? Relational databases, where you have to design or you have to come up with a database schema. So we only use just keys and values, and then persistent or volatile. So we have something called volatile and non-volatile, especially when it comes to the computer hardware. So probably you can look into that. Then examples, for example, we have a database called Redis. We also have like AWS DynamoDB. These two actually uses what? NoSQL database. So in future, if you get to, let's say, connected or have the opportunity of learning the NoSQL database or learning the Redis or AWS DynamoDB, then automatically you are interacting with a type of database called what? NoSQL database. So then going down, we also have something called Relational Database Management System. So apart from the types of databases, we are inclining ourselves into one type of database, and that is what? Relational database. So we need to understand what this relational database is. So Relational Database Management System, this is the system that controls. So an RDBMS, in short, or Relational Database Management System, is the software that gives users the ability to update, query, and administer a relational database. Query and administer a relational database. Structured query language, SQL or SQL, is typically the standard programming language used to access the database. So one language that can be used to access the database or to access any relational database is actually referred to as SQL. That is the only way you can maneuver through the relational database, whether it is MySQL, whether it is Oracle database, whether it is Microsoft SQL Server database. All of this must be accessed via what? Or via SQL language. So that means we will be learning how to use SQL language. Then another part, like another definition, or just to understand more about Relational Database Management System, or RDBMS, is that a Relational Database Management System, RDBMS, is a database management system that is based on the relational model. So it has the following major components. For example, we are talking about the features of a relational what? Of a relational database. Now here, the features is that the components, a table must always be there for it to qualify as a relational database management system. A record, tuple, or row, this is just like one word. So if you are asked like what is another name for row, then you can talk about the tuple or record. What is another name for record? You can talk about the tuple and row. What is another name for tuple? You can talk about the record and the row. And then we also have the fields. Fields is equals to columns. And then we also have the column and attribute. So these are the major features or the major characteristics of what? Any database that falls under RDBMS. So examples of the most popular RDBMS are MySQL, which we are going to interact with it. We also have the Oracle database. This one, it means that if we are able, that is after the certificate level, we advance to the diploma part, we will be introduced into the Oracle database. And then we also have like the IBM DB2 and Microsoft SQL Server database. So if you ever interacted with the Microsoft SQL Server database, you've already interacted with what? RDBMS. So for any database development, any database that you can interact with, and you are able, having the ability to store data in tables, or having the ability to create a table and then storing the data into that particular table, then you are already interacting with what? RDBMS, or relational database. Now, MySQL database, going to specific now. So what is MySQL database? So MySQL database is an open source relational database management system. You see, the same thing is happening again, that it's an open source. Why open source? Because it is freely available. It is freely available for download, for modifications, and all that. So it's actually a relational database management system. A relational database organizes data into one or more data tables. So the keyword is data tables, in which data types may be related to each other. And these relations help structure the data. These relations help structure the data. MySQL, again, is a relational database management system based on SQL or based on SQL, which is structured query language. The application is used for a wide range of purposes. The application is used for a wide range of purposes, including data warehousing, e-commerce, and logging applications. So the most common use for MySQL, however, is for the purpose of a web database. So sometimes we can talk about web database or web application because you can actually interact with MySQL in different ways, especially if you're a website, let's say a software developer and you are specializing in web design or web development, then you can also use MySQL in a different way to act as your backend database. But when it comes to also interacting MySQL database on the SQL part, we can also use the word, the language SQL or SQL. So this is how or what MySQL database is all about. Then how do we access MySQL database? So yesterday we talked about the installation, or we actually saw the installation part. And we were interested with a lot of things, which were part and parcel of the installation process. Now, so after you are done with the installation, how can you access MySQL database? So MySQL command line client is one of the way or one method you can access MySQL database. That means MySQL command line client is a simple SQL shell with input line editing capabilities. So we always have like a shell which interacts any command that we try to run. So it's either now you choose that you want to access MySQL database via MySQL command line client, or you can choose to access it via MySQL Workbench. So what is MySQL Workbench here? So MySQL Workbench here is actually a unified virtual tool for database architects, developers, and DBAs. So DBAs for database administrators. MySQL Workbench provides data modeling, SQL development, and comprehensive administration tools for server configuration, user administration, backup, and much more. So when it comes to MySQL database, it's a very technical, MySQL Workbench, it's a very technical and more in-depth graphical user interface application. So in other words, MySQL command line client is more of command-based, but MySQL Workbench is more of graphical user interface. So that's all about shedding some lights around MySQL database. Now, so the next part is just to see how do we interact with this? How do we interact to this? Now, before you interact with the MySQL database, we also need to talk about, let's say, one part. And here I want to talk about something called SQL statements. Since we will do what? Since we will incline ourselves on MySQL, NoSQL. So this is exactly what we will be doing. MySQL, SQL. So we will learn SQL language through what? Through this particular database. So before we use the database, we need to come up with SQL. Understand SQL. So here I want to talk about SQL statements. So when it comes to SQL statements, remember it stands for what? It stands for structured query language. Into bracket SQL. So what are these types of SQL? Types of language. So there are 4 things that we must actually come into terms, and they are very, very okay. So don't worry about. So number 1, we have something called data. Okay, let me have like data manipulation. Data manipulation language. Into bracket, we have DML. So with this, this is actually like one language. And with this, okay, let me just do this. So with this, it means that they are used. So the keywords, let's say the keywords, because we will be dealing with the keywords. The keywords here are meant to manipulate the database. So what are these keywords? I.e., we have like select, we have update, we have delete, and then we have insert. So these are what? These are the keywords that are there. These are keywords that falls under that. Now, number two, about another part. Okay, number two. Okay, let me just do this. So we have, so number two, we have something called data definition language. So for data definition language, this one is DDL. Data definition language means what? So for data definition language, it means that the keywords, so I'm just using like a mere keywords here, are meant to define, the database structure. When it comes to defining, say that it's adding something to the database. So i.e., we have what? We have create, we have alter, we have drop, we also have truncate, etc. Number three, we have data control language. Data control language. This one is DCL. So here the keywords means what? So the keywords here are meant to control the database. So what are the keywords here? I.e., we have, for example, only two commands. We have revoke and what? And grant. So you can grant a right or a privilege to a user or to an object. And then lastly, we have something called transactional control language. Transactional control language. So this one is what? TCL. So this one means what? The keywords here are meant to do what? To alter the transactions. So when you talk about the transactions, so we have these keywords. For example, you can commit a transaction, you can roll back a transaction, you can save point, create a save point to a transaction. So these are very important what? These are keywords. All these are SQL statements. All these are SQL statements. So we will ensure that we come into terms with all these. So that is how we will actually be in a position to understand how this works. So we have all these keywords or these SQL statements or the SQL statements. So there are actually four. Data manipulation language, DML, data definition language, DDL, data control language, DCLs, and transactional control language, TCL. So you can even call them in plural, but in short, DMLs, DDLs, DCLs, and TCLs. So these are actually how we use them. Now, so to cut the story short, probably coming to towards the end of this session, I want to show you what we actually we did install yesterday about MySQL installer. We actually went through the process. That's a step-by-step guide. But I want to show you now the actual software because already it is installed within my system. So if you come to this part, or if you go to the search bar or even to the icon before the search bar and click it, you will be in a position to see what? To see MySQL 8.0, that is the latest version. We have the command line client. So if you click at the command line client, it will open this particular window. And again, if you go to, let's say, Workbench, let's say MySQL Workbench. Where is the Workbench? We have this Workbench here. So if I click at it again, then the Workbench is going to come up. Now, remember during your installation, you were prompted to enter password. You are prompted to enter password. So because of security reasons and all that, whether you want to interact with the command line client or interact with MySQL Workbench, you will always be prompted to enter that password. You will always be prompted to enter that password. So if you look closely at this, I am actually prompted to enter the password, like enter password. That is through the MySQL command line client. And the same thing happens to what? The same thing is happening on the side of MySQL Workbench. So with MySQL Workbench, you are also required. For example, if I click here, this is how it is. So if you click at this MySQL connection under that, we have something that says local instance. So if you click at that, it will give you a pop-up window, and the same thing happens again. So, and you will, since you actually initiated or you are prompted to enter the password and you enter during your installation, so here again, you'll be prompted to use the same password just to get into the platform. So let's start, for example, at this point. This is the command line client. So I have my password as MySQL-0123. If you press enter, this is how it opens up. This is how it opens up. And again, if I can go back to my SQL Workbench and put my SQL-123 and press enter, then again, it opens up. So you see, this is how we interact with what? This is now my SQL Workbench. So you can see we are interacting with it graphically. But on the other side, we are interacting with this command or via command. So just to kill the curiosity that how do we use this? For example, because it's our database. If I want to show databases, you can just type show databases so that you can see the equality. So you can see type show databases. So if you press enter, then automatically it shows you all the databases that are there by default. And just to bring the relationship between command line client or the similarity, then you can go back to my SQL Workbench and type the same what? The same databases. So ensure that you put a semicolon. So we'll discuss that. So after that, you will find out that we have this icon here. So if you click at it, then you are executing. And you can see that we have the same databases, the same number of databases, which is equals to this. So this one is equals to these ones. Yeah. So that is how we interact with what? With my SQL Workbench. And that is also how we interact with my SQL command line client. So with that, I think we are coming towards the end of this. And we are ready now to start on using MySQL Workbench and my SQL command line client on our next class. So see you and have a nice day. Thank you.